Okay, so we've done two things so far. We've saved a PDI file as an SVG. We've uploaded it to a document library. Now's the time for the big finish. Let's add the Pi graphic web part and hook that up to the SVG file. So I'll go out and find Pi graphic. Now you notice it's going to be deposited without configuration, which is nothing new because that's what's happened to every other web part we've used so far. And yeah, there we go. We need to modify this shared web part. And the configuration items we're adding this time are a link, or excuse me, a reference to where you will find that SVG file. Now, as you can see, there's other things we can configure as well, the default timestamp, etc., period of time, etc. But let's just go out and browse for this graphics file that we just saved. I'm going to choose the browse option. And I'll go out to look for all of my document libraries. The convention in SharePoint is the two dots mean to go up one level. So let me go up one level and see if I can find it. Now, yeah, I had created a display called ProcessBook Files, if you remember, a document library called ProcessBook Files. And that's where I just uploaded this SVG. So I'll go ahead and select it there. Yeah, there's my reference. Of course, you could have typed that in there by hand if you had wanted to. Now there's a second file here, a second option here, and they're actually put on even levels, like they're kind of, you would be using these all the time. Actually, this XSL transform file, we don't anticipate a great deal of folks are going to be using it. It's for doing the so-called XSLT transformation of an XML file so that you can customize what appears in that SVG. For example, if you wanted to add some JavaScript that would be active when you launch that display, this is the mechanism to do that. It's not something I would start, at 3 p.m. on a Friday. It's people tell me this XSLT format is fairly complex. It's basically a programming job. So yeah, but you can take a look in the documentation to find out more about that. Things like changing the server names from one server to another so you can reuse the same file on different sites just using this transform file. That's the option, or that's what you can do with this. As I said, it's not something that a lot of users are going to be using. Now, we also have this option here called current context path. We'll take a look at that in more detail later on when we talk about element and module relative displays. But this is basically how it works. With an element relative display in the Pi AF database, you can set up a display that makes reference to Pi tags as attributes or properties of elements. And by changing the context, what you do is as you switch from one element to another, for example, from one pump to a second pump, we can display different information. With an element relative display, if you use that display as an SVG file, you can specify what the context is. In other words, which element you're currently pointing at. So you could, again, take that same file, just change the context path from one element to the other, and you would see a different set of Pi tags. So as I said, we will take a look at this in much more detail when we talk about element relative displays. Okay, I'll go ahead and click on OK. And here's the end result. There's our graphic. And if I go into view mode without exiting the edit mode, it looks like this. Okay, let's go back and do some modifications to this. I think I may want to change the size of this because that's got some borders at the edge I'm not interested in. I do want to make a couple of points though. One of the points is that when we set this reference to the SVG file, I said that you typically upload this to a document library. As you saw right here, this is our reference to the document library. But you could have instead made a UNC reference, the / reference to a shared server somewhere. Now also, one of the things I think is helpful is to set the size of this so that it's roughly the same size as the original. And people always ask now, how can I figure out, how can I make this look better? Right now, I'm not sure if we're really looking at the full size, the original size as it appeared in ProcessBook. It looks a little smaller than it was in ProcessBook. So one of the things you can do is explicitly set the height and width. Of course, to do that, you need to know what the height and width of the original are. So one of the things you can do is change this to 100% inside ProcessBook. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And then just measure this in pixels. You can do a screen print of this, paste it into Microsoft Paint, and then measure the pixels. So I know by working with this particular display, this is around 500 by 800 pixels. So if I go back in here, I can specify. Now let me go ahead and edit this page. I can specify exactly what size I'm interested in. So I'm going to change this in the appearance section. There we go. So I know this is going to be, let's say, about 500 by 860. I'll go ahead and apply and then say OK. Actually, we could have just said OK as well. No big difference there. And I'll exit edit mode. And that looks a little bit better. So now we don't have the borders, and I'm positive I've got 100% of the size that I'm interested in. Now when you're working within this display, there are a couple of features you should know about. When you double click on any of these active objects, you can do an ad hoc trend of that object. Yeah, there we go. There's our ad hoc trend. And there's an option in the Adobe SVG Viewer where you can zoom in and zoom out. So if you need to do that, you can do that. I mentioned earlier, if you have access to the document library, read-write access, you can go ahead and actually edit this in place. So one of the options in here, as you can see, is this Launch in ProcessBook. I'll go ahead and choose Launch in ProcessBook. What this will do is, like any good web-based application, it's going to warn you, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to open this file? I'll go ahead and acknowledge, and this goes out. As you can see, it's actually launched this in place. I can make changes to this. So if I say, well, this trend really could be bigger, I'll go ahead and do that. And if I don't particularly like the grid, I'll go ahead and take the grid off. And there we go. And then save this back, and this is something that will be preserved. You can also save it locally and then upload it back to the document library. Yeah, I'll go ahead and close out of that. Go back in here. You may have to actually refresh. Let me go ahead and refresh my display. And we should see that these changes have been implemented. There we go. So we see we got a bigger trend and no grid. Now that round trip that I just did is that's only one of the ways you can edit this. I could also go into the document library itself. And that's one of the options you'll see in the document library. I'd like to make one final point about this option called Launch in ProcessBook. I described it earlier as though the only reason you might want to do this is if you needed to edit this file. But remember, the other reason that you might want to do this is because the tools available in ProcessBook are, well, they're richer. It's a rich client application.